They say childhood is a time of innocence, a time of discovery, a time when the world is still full of wonder and possibility. But what if your childhood ended before it truly began? What if, before you could even understand the meaning of the word marriage, you were already promised to a stranger? What if your entire future was decided not by dreams or desire, but by the cold calculations of men who saw you not as a person, but as a bargaining chip? In medieval Europe, this wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a rare tragedy whispered about in hushed tones. It was simply the way things were. For the vast majority of women born into the medieval world, marriage was never about love. It was never about companionship or mutual respect. It was a transaction, plain and simple. A binding contract forged not in the hearts of two people, but in the cold deliberations of families seeking power, land, or political advantage. Among the nobility, daughters were assets to be traded, leveraged, and deployed like pieces on a chessboard. A marriage could seal an alliance between warring houses, expand territorial holdings, or end a conflict that had raged for generations. The girl herself, her feelings, her fears, her hopes for the future, they were irrelevant. She was a means to an end, nothing more. The age at which these arrangements began is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Girls could be betrothed as young as 7 years old, 7. An age when most children are still learning to read, still playing games, still believing that the world is a safe and magical place. But for a medieval girl of noble birth, 7 was old enough to be promised to a man she had never met, a man who might be twice her age or more, a man who would one day own her completely. And by the age of 12, under the laws of the church, she was considered old enough to be married. Not because she was emotionally ready, not because she had reached any meaningful level of maturity, but because the church said so. And in medieval Europe, what the church said was law. In the year 1270, a French jurist named Guillaume Durand put it bluntly when he wrote that marriage is not a matter of love, but of property and law. There was no romance in his words, no pretense that marriage was anything other than what it truly was, a legal arrangement designed to benefit the families involved. And if this was the reality for noble women, one might assume that peasant women, who had no estates to protect and no political alliances to forge, would have had more freedom. But that assumption would be wrong. Peasant women were just as bound by the decisions of others, perhaps even more so. A lord could refuse to allow a marriage if it did not serve his economic interests. A father could arrange a match to settle a debt or secure a plot of land, and the girl herself had no more say in the matter than the livestock her family owned. The church, which claimed to be the protector of the weak and the champion of the oppressed, did require that both parties consent to the marriage. But consent, in practice, was little more than a formality. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, standing in a room surrounded by men, your father, your uncles, the local priest, perhaps even the man you're about to marry. You are asked if you agree to the union. What are you supposed to say? You have been raised your entire life to obey. You have been taught that defiance is a sin, that your duty is to serve your family, that your own desires are selfish and unimportant. And even if you could summon the courage to refuse, what would happen? Would you be beaten? Would you be cast out? Would you be forced anyway? The historian Eileen Power, who spent years examining court records and ecclesiastical documents from the medieval period, found case after case of women who later claimed they had never truly consented to their marriages. Some had been coerced, some had been threatened, some had been taken by force and married against their will, with no legal recourse and no one willing to listen to their protests. And once the marriage was complete, whatever small measure of autonomy a woman might have had vanished entirely. In England and much of Europe, a married woman entered a legal status known as femme covert, which essentially meant that her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to exist as an independent person in the eyes of the law. She could not own property. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue anyone in court or be sued herself. She could not even leave her own home without her husband's permission. Everything she had, her possessions, her body, her future, belonged to him. The Magna Carta, that great charter of English liberties, offered no protections to women. Canon law, the law of the church, reinforced male dominance at every turn, citing scripture to justify the subjugation of women. Genesis declared that a wife's desire shall be to her husband, and he shall rule over her. And so he did. But if marriage was a prison for medieval women, then childbirth was the executioner. In a world without modern medicine, without anesthesia, without even a basic understanding of hygiene, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. And she was expected to do it over and over again, because a woman's value in medieval society was measured in large part by her ability to produce children, particularly sons. Noble women endured pregnancy after pregnancy in the desperate hope of securing a male heir. Peasant women bore children because that was what married women did, because the church commanded heirsdom, because there was no other option. The mortality rates are staggering. Modern estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 births resulted in the mother's death. Think about that for a moment. If a woman had 6 children, there was a very real chance she would not survive to see them all grow up. Complications were common and often fatal. Obstructed labor, when the baby could not pass through the birth canal, was a death sentence. While men and women were theoretically subject to the same legal codes, the reality was that women faced harsher treatment, especially when accused of moral or sexual offenses. Adultery, promiscuity, even suspected immodesty could result in public humiliation or worse. English records from the 13th century describe women convicted of adultery being paraded through the streets wearing nothing but their undergarments, their heads shaved, while crowds jeered and threw filth at them. This was justice in medieval Europe, punishment designed not just to hurt, but to shame. For more serious crimes, the penalties were even crueler. Theft could result in mutilation, ears cut off, faces branded, fingers severed. And for women, these punishments carried an added layer of shame because their gender itself was seen as a mark of inherent weakness and deceitfulness. In 1324, a woman named Jeanne de Brigue was burned alive in Paris, accused of sorcery and theft. Her gender was cited as evidence of her guilt, as if being a woman made her more likely to be a criminal. The church had its own courts, and they were no more merciful. Women accused of fornication, blasphemy, or heresy were dragged before ecclesiastical judges who offered little hope of acquittal. A woman who spoke too freely, who questioned authority, who dared to think for herself, was viewed with suspicion. The Decretum Gratiani, a foundational text of canon law written in the 12th century, warned that a talkative woman is like a leaking roof. Silence and obedience were virtues. Dissent was sin. Torture was used to extract confessions, and women with their lower legal standing were especially vulnerable. Inquisitorial records show that many women confessed simply to end the pain, sealing their own fates. And once accused, there were few options. A woman could be dunked in water, flogged, locked in a pillory, or executed, often in public, always to make an example. Justice did not protect women. It punished them. And nowhere was this more evident than in the witch hunts. While the most infamous witch trials occurred in the early modern period, their roots lay deep in medieval thought. For centuries, the church and society at large had viewed women with suspicion as spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, more easily corrupted by evil. When misfortune struck, a crop failure, an outbreak of disease, the death of a child, someone had to be blamed. And that someone was often a woman, usually an older woman, a poor woman, a woman who lived alone or spoke too boldly or simply made someone uncomfortable. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, though technically an early modern text, was built on centuries of medieval theology that linked women to sin and evil. The book declared that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. And with that, the hunts intensified. Trials offered little hope. Torture was routine. A woman might be accused by a neighbor after a quarrel, then imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured until she confessed to impossible crimes, flying on broomsticks, consorting with demons, cursing livestock. The more she denied it, the more she was tortured. And once she confessed, she was executed, often by burning, in front of a crowd. Between 75 and 85% of those accused of witchcraft across Europe were women. They were not criminals. They were scapegoats, victims of fear, ignorance, and a system that weaponized religion and law to control the most vulnerable. The medieval world was not cruel by accident. It was designed to bind women to silence, suffering, and servitude. Every forced marriage, every death in childbirth, every unjust sentence, every execution reflected a society built on fear and control. History does not fade, it echoes. And those echoes remind us of the cost of a world where half the population is seen not as human, but as property. As the 12th century chronicler Orderic Vitalis observed, the customs of the time were more cruel to women than to men, for they bore burdens without reward and died without glory.